In today's video, we're going to be creating this beautiful calculator using vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. I think this is a prerequisite when you're first starting out to code to learn how to create your own calculator, right? This is not something new or innovative. There's a lot of tutorials out there that everyone implements their own calculator in their own little ways, right? So this is one way that I like to do it. So if you guys enjoy this content, please be sure to like, subscribe, and let's get started. All right, guys, so get started on our calculator. Let's go over to our folder directory, and we're going to create 3 new files. First one, of course, is going to be our index.html file. Once that is created, all right, we are in here now. Simply, you just have to hit the exclamation point, and it should open up an HTML document. A few things we want to do, of course, is change out the title. I'll just name this calculator. It's always good standard practice, like we've talked about. Let's go over to our directory. Let's create another folder. And in this one, we're going to name this one script.js. It's going to create our JavaScript. We'll work on that last. And then, of course, our CSS. So we're going to name that styles.css. Okay, and so they should all be inside of our directory of our folder. So again, going back to our HTML, inside of our HTML, we want to add a few things. We want to make sure that we link all of our CSS and our JavaScript. So I'm already getting the link relay style sheet href styles.css. And so what that's doing is essentially connecting our CSS inside of our folder. And I'm sure if I do the same, it'll probably link our script, and there it is, right? So we have our script, source script.js script, right? So you just hit save to make sure that's saved in there. If you also want to add a font, we can go over to our Google really quickly. Inside of our Google, we just type in Google Fonts. And we want to add a few of them, right? Or at least a good one. One of my favorite ones is, of course, Roboto. Usually I like to use enter. So if we go over to enter, we want to copy, usually you want all of them, right? So let's go ahead and click on a few of them. Up till bold should be okay, okay? And then we just open up our selected family list, right? We make sure we have all of the ones that we want. And we simply just copy this one right here. And so we paste that inside of our head tag inside of our HTML, right? So we can hit Control Save. And so that automatically will import our fonts from Google. That way we have that nice font that we all like to see. And then now we can get started inside of our body tags, all right? We'll make sure to keep this one open right here, just because we're going to have our fonts family. So once we go into our CSS, in fact, let's actually do that right now, right? So let's copy that. Let's exit out of that. Let's go over to our CSS really quickly. And let's open up our HTML right here. And inside of that, we just paste that in there, right? So that way now, all of our HTML is going to be inside of that font family, which is that Enter sans serif. So we can exit out of our CSS really quickly. And so now we can go back inside of our body tag. And this is where we begin to structure our calculator. The first thing we need to do is add a div. And that div is going to need an ID of calculator, right? So that's going to enact almost like a container. So any stylized background or sizing changes that we need to make, we'll make sure to add that in there. And inside of that, we're going to need to add a few other divs, all right? Inside of that, we're going to add actually a class, and we're going to have a calculator grid actually. Ignore the ignore the syntax is showing up. That's from my GitHub Copilot, assuming what it thinks I want to do. But I actually want to do a class of calculator grid. And inside of our calculator grid, we're actually going to have a div with 2 divs inside of that one. But first, we're going to give this one a class as well of output. And inside of that output, Okay, we're going to have the div of data previous. So this is where we're going to add our JavaScript names. So that way, when we go over to our JavaScript, they'll be completely functional. And then we'll add our class here. Make sure that that is inside actually. I noticed why that wasn't shown up here, but we want to make sure we have a div inside of that that says data previous operand. And then inside of that, we're also going to have a class of previous operand, right? So one's going to work for our JavaScript, the other one's going to be for our CSS. And so outside of that div, we're going to have another div, and we're going to have pretty much the same thing, right? So data current operand, just like the way it's showing up on there. And then we're going to have a class of current operand as well. And so once we have those inside of it, we can then just go outside of the output div. And now we can start importing all of our buttons, okay? So inside of that, we're going to have a button. And we can either just import all our buttons at once, but I feel like that's going to be confusing. So I'm just going to go step by step and do each one individually before we just start spamming a bunch of buttons. This one, we're going to have a data delete. So we're going to have our delete button, right? So make sure we spell that correctly. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues later on. And in that one, we're actually going to have a back arrow button. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this just because I don't necessarily have the back button space on my keyboard. I'm going to link the code in the description below. Of course, this doesn't have to be a back button. This could also just say delete or DEL. So that could work as well. So I guess for the sake of this video, we're just going to keep that as DEL for delete. And then we're going to also include another button. And inside of that, we're going to have the data operation button, right? That usually looks like this, right? Once we get out of that button, we're going to add a break, okay? The reason for that is because it's now going to go below, right? So if you remember how calculators look, they're usually in squares and they're going to be in rows of, I believe, 4 by 5, right? Don't quote me on that. I'll look back after as I'm editing this video and I'll probably make that correction. But we're going to go ahead and add another button, and this one's going to be the data delete. I'm sorry. We're going to go ahead and add another button. This one's going to be the data pi actually. So this one's going to be the pi operator. And for this one, I'm going to go ahead and copy that syntax just because, again, we're going to copy the button just because I don't have that on my keyboard. Or again, we can just type in pi, which is fine, but I think I'll stick to the pi operator. And then I'm going to add another one called, this one's going to be button. And then this is going to be data operation for division. So we're just going to call this data operation. Okay. This is going to be our division. So we're going to have our data operation for division. And then afterwards, we can have all of our numbers following after that. All right. So we just simply say button, data number just like that. And we're going to start with 1. All right. And so what I'll do just to speed things up a little bit here, I'm just going to copy this over 3 times or 2 times. I'm sorry. Make sure this is below right here. And then we're going to name this one 2 and then 3. Just like that. And then we're going to go ahead and bring in another data operation button. So we can go ahead and copy the top one above, just like that. And that's going to separate it because, again, it's going to be in rows of, I believe, 4. So you're going to have 1, 2, 3, and then an operation, and then 4, 5, 6 operation, just like the way a calculator is formatted, right? It's usually like the operators are on the right hand side. So you got to make sure that they're in the order of the grid, right? It'll make sense as we progress. And so then below that, we're going to go ahead and add another of our buttons, right? So 1, 2, 3. I'll just hit Control Save. It should format these the way I need it to. If not, okay. So just like that, right? So we're going to switch these out with 4, 5, 6, just like that. And before I forget, let's change out this operation button from division over to I believe multiplication. So I'll just go ahead and copy that, or you can just type in like an X or something, just like that. So it's going to be our multiplication. And then same concept, right? So let's copy over our data operation again. And this one's going to be our subtraction. And then below that, again, as you guessed it, we're going to have more buttons as well. So let's copy those. And this is going to be 7, 8, and 9, okay? So that's going to be the last of our buttons, right? Because there's only 9 numbers, makes sense. And we're going to bring in one last data operation, of course. And that's going to be our addition, right? So that shows up right there. And with the addition now, we can just introduce another break in between our HTML. And of course, we have to bring in our 0 actually. So in this case, GitHub Copilot is correct, right? We want to make sure that we bring in that 0. And then we're going to bring in the last couple of the buttons in there. So the last one's actually going to be a button for the data number, okay? And that data number is going to be a decimal point, right? And then lastly, to finish it off, we're going to have, of course, our equal button, okay? So data dash equal, right? So of course, once that is finished, we got to make sure that we can bring it all together after we do our addition, right? So once we have all of that together, that should look, I think, just about right. So we have our delete button. We have our all of our numbers, our operators. I even went ahead and added a pi number, right, for 3.14. And then now we should just be able to open that. So you can either go ahead and hit the go live button right here if you have that extension app. Or if you don't, I believe you should just be able to copy this, copy the link and just run it inside of your browser, okay? So to do this, we're just going to go ahead and like crop it right here. And let's actually bring over our VS Code and let's just shorten that right there so we can at least see both of them next to each other. And as you can see right here, we have all of our buttons, right? Of course, it doesn't look stylized at all whatsoever. But if you do hover over that, it does have some kind of effect right there. But of course, when we click on that, it doesn't work, right? So we have to bring that into our JavaScript. But before we do that, I like to stylize things first. I don't know why. I think, in my opinion, when you stylize certain items and then eventually make it functional, to me, it just makes more sense, right? So now we can just go over to our styles.css. I already went ahead and added the font family. In fact, if you actually were to mark this out, you can see that it probably changes the way it looks. And so if you were to go say something along the lines of like font size, I'm sure if you were to bring it up to font pixels, you could say like 100 pixels, I believe, and it should update that, right? So if you copy that, I'm sure if you can, it'll probably do that. If not, so this is actually good practice, right? That's why you always want to make sure all your code is being tested here. So if not, we can also just bring in asterisks. Usually that asterisk also affects that styles. So let's confirm that our style sheet is connected. So let's go back to our relay href style. See, that's the issue. All right, guys, this is why it's always good to make sure your code is all connected. So we notice right here, our href, it's spelled style.css. Our folder, inside of our folder, the file section, it's called styles.css. All right, so there's an S right there. So little minor corrections come a long ways, right? So you want to make sure that those are being affected there. So this should actually update now. Let's go back to, and let's type in HTML, and it should work there, right? So every time I font size, it should have made it a little bit bigger, right? So if you even say 100 pixels, there you go, right? So it actually affects it the way you want it to look. Of course, we don't want to do that right now. We'll go ahead and mess with that after. So now let's mess with our sizing of our dimensions on the outside of this, right? So to do that, we need to bring in an asterisk. We're going to say asterisk before, after, asterisk, and then asterisk after, just like that. And we're going to make sure to give this a box sizing, just like that, of border box. And then if we already went ahead and added a font family, so we can just move on to the next part. Okay. And below that, we want to go into our body, right? Inside of our body, let's make sure to add our padding 0. That's always good practice, because sometimes, usually there might be some like inherent sizing that's browsers tend to give your code. So you want to make sure you go ahead and place these at 0, just like that. We're going to go ahead and add a background size of 300%, right? And then we're going to add a background image actually. And this is what's going to give us that linear gradient. All right. And in this case, we're going to give this a class inside of our gradient. We're just going to call this gradient, just like that. Okay. And then we're going to add an animation so that gradient isn't just stagnant. And we're going to say background animation. And we're going to give this a 5-second loop. That can also determine the way you want it to be, how fast you want that. So if you want it to be a little bit slower, you can switch this from 5 seconds over to 10 seconds or 15 seconds. It doesn't really matter, right? So we're here to build a calculator at the end of the day. So we're going to add a gradient. We're going to say linear gradient, just like that. And we're going to give this a 90 degrees, right? So it's facing vertically, I guess that's the word. And then we're going to start off with our first color. So it's going to be EEF6352. And again, guys, just so you guys have, I guess, a visual image of what that looks like. That's just going to be our, just type in color, hex color. You can see it's just like this like salmon looking color. It's all preferential. That's just the way I like to make things look. So we're going to start off with this little salmon looking color. And inside of our parentheses, again, we want to make sure that we start off with our third color. I'm just going to say purple. And then lastly, we're going to finish it off with what I believe is a blue color, if I remember. 6352. Right, so we can actually copy that. Again, go into like color picker and just paste that in there. You can see what color that is. It's actually like another like salmon looking color, I believe, 6352. Yeah, okay, so it's just going to basically go to like pink, purple, then back to pink, whatever. But we can switch this out later depending on how we want it to look, okay? So that doesn't really matter right now, but we're just gonna hit Control Save. And then now we can go into our keyframes actually of our animation. So we're going to say keyframes. We're going to say background animation. And inside of that, we're going to start off with our 0. And we're going to say background position. And it's going to be left actually. And they're going to start off with our 50% mark. And we're going to say right, just like that. And our 100% is going to be back to left, right? And then once we hit Control Save, it should format because we're using Prettier plugin. So it formats it really nicely. And now, as you remember in our HTML, we had our first div, which is an ID, okay? So we're going to stylize that now. So inside of that, to bring that up, we actually have to use our hashtag. And we're going to say calculator grid. And then we're going to give that a display of grid, of course, right? Because we want this to be pieced out in, I believe, a 4x6, I believe, something like that. We'll see once we format it, right? Once we start to format everything. So we got to give that a grid. And then we're going to say justify content. We want everything to be centered, okay? And then we want everything to be aligned as well. So align content, just like that. We want that to be centered as well. And then we're going to give everything a grid template. We want everything to repeat by 4 times, right? So we're going to make sure this is 100 pixels, right? Since we're doing everything by pixels instead of by REMs or anything else. So we want to make sure that that grid repeats 4 times over. And then we're going to say grid template rows, just like that, min max. We're going to say that's 120 pixels. And then we're going to give its height an auto, right? So we want to make sure that the width is saying, hey, it's 120 pixels. And then the width or the height, I'm sorry, will follow suit, right? So make sure that it's a box basically, that each little grid is a box. So we didn't say 6 by 100, right? So yeah, so we're saying 6 rows. So basically what we're saying is that we're going to make sure that everything is centered right here, right? All of our content is going to be centered, and then we want everything to line up as well, centered, both vertically and horizontally. Afterwards, we're going to, since we gave it a display of grid, we want to make sure that this grid has 4 horizontal grids, and that's each one has a height or width, whatever, of 100. And then the last one is going to be that it repeats 6 times over down, and that it's going to have also a height of 100 pixels, right? Or 120, whatever. So once we start to stylize each individual button, this should start to update, right? So we'll make sure this comes together. Okay, so let's make sure, right? So our calculator grid, this is for our ID. If we go back here, this is where we gave that second class a class of calculator grid. Just like that. Okay. So it looks like I kind of messed up a little bit. I must have missed the calculator from what I'm seeing here. So let's go over back to our calculator. So I think this is what's the issue is why we're not seeing it update. I was wondering. So let's go back to our calculator ID, not the calculator class. And we're actually going to give this a max width of 400 pixels. And we're going to go ahead and say background color. And we're going to give this an RGBA, right? So that's going to be your red, green, blue, and then your opacity. So we're going to say 242, 242, 247. And then we're going to give this an opacity of 0.7, just like that. And then we're going to make sure to give this a margin of 0 with auto, right? So that's going to be your left and right. We're going to give this a top position of 100 pixels, just like that. A position, we're going to say relative. Border radius, right? So a little bit of a curve. 10 pixels, that might be a little too much. Let's say 5 pixels, right? That's your curve of each individual one. So as you can see now, we're actually affecting the actual calculator itself. And then we're just going to give each one a box shadow. So, right, so that gives us a little bit of some dimension. Just makes it looks a little bit nicer. So we're going to say that's 8 pixels, 0. Oh, excuse me. And we're just going to give that again an RGB of 0, 0, 0, and then just an opacity of 0.2, just like that. And same thing, right? So we're going to say 6 pixels by 20 pixels, and then 0, and then RGBA, and then same concept, right? So 0, and then this one should be actually 0.19, yeah, just like that, right? So you can see now our calculator has a nice little box grid that's with little box shadow, I'm sorry, and a little bit of some rounded corners right there. And then this one, once I change this over to a class, just like that, it should affect the entire thing, okay? So I made the mistake of making, for some reason, skipping over to the calculator grid instead of the calculator. And so it wasn't necessarily formatting, and I was wondering why. But again, little mistakes like that, we're all human. I tend to make them quite a bit. But since this one's a ID, we have to use a hashtag. Remember, the first one's always going to be, anytime you see an ID, that's going to be a hashtag right here. And since the second one is a class, we have to have our class right here. So our class little decimal point. Okay. So now that we have that, you can see it's already being formatted pretty nicely. Hopefully once we get towards the end of it, this should format a little bit better. I might have messed up a little bit, but we'll see. I believe it's been a few months since I've actually worked on a calculator. Okay, but again, not functional, but it is starting to come together, and it's looking quite nicely. Okay, so now that we have that, let's work on our calculator grid. All right, so let's just copy this class right here. Let's go down and let's bring this down a little bit. And this is going to be actually your button, and we're going to say hover, right? So this is what happens when you hover over the buttons. Again, just to make it a little bit nicer, I like to stylize things quite a bit. And it's totally unnecessary, guys, for making a calculator, but I like to make things look pretty snazzy. 242, and then again 247 with an opacity of 9. All right, so let's save that. You can see once we hover over them, how it actually makes it stand out quite a bit, right? So now the buttons actually have a nicer look to them when you hover over that. And so now we can go over to our HTML. So now that we have our calculator grid, we can then begin working on the actual buttons themselves individually, right? So to do that, to call those buttons, we have to bring up the button, and we say nth child actually. So the nth child represents a specific number, right? So in this case, we're going to be calling the 5th one, right? So that one, I believe, should be our pi actually. So our pi 5th, we're going to give this a font weight. We're going to say this is bold, right? So just like that. So you can see now our pi is bolded. And it's just to give an idea of why I chose the 5th one. If you just count from left to right and then move out down to the second, it counts to 5, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So that's why when we call the 5th child, we're calling the pi. And then we're going to do that over again. We're just going to say nth child, and I'm going to call the 9th one, I believe, just like that. And this one, we're going to give this a font size of 2, and we're not giving this one a font weight. Instead, what we're doing is going to give this one a background color, just like that. And I like to give this one a custom color of 20B1AA, just like that. So you can see now, right? Totally unnecessary, but right, it just gives that one a color as well. And so we're going to do that across the board for a few of them. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these right here just because they're stylized, and it's really not too important. I don't want you guys to get hung up on the stylized of each one. So I'm just going to copy this over from my GitHub, which again, the link will be down in the description below. So you can see, right, we just simply went in there and we stylized them to give them a certain background color. And so now to more of a functional I guess CSS. We're going to give each one a span to. We're going to bring up our span to class. And we're going to say grid column span to. So let's make sure, did we add that in our HTML? Okay, so it looks like I might have messed up here. Okay, I believe, let's make sure, span, okay. Styles.css. Or span to class. So it looks like that is non-existent. So for now, we're just going to go ahead and actually remove that. So let's go ahead and remove that span to. Let's move this down a little bit. So now we can begin working on our output class, right? So our output class is representative of our previous and our current operand buttons, right? So to do that, let's go ahead and bring up the output class, just like that. And we're going to give this one a grid column. We're going to say 1 dash negative, just like that, -1. We're then going to give this one a background color, right? So you can say that. I believe this one actually just wants to be 0.1, just like that. So 242.247.01. And then we're going to give this one a display of flex, okay? And as you can see, what that's actually doing is making sure that we have spacing on top. This is where our numbers are going to be displayed. And then we're going to have a space right here in between where we have that span. So we have that spacing between the operators on the right and then our numbers. So everything's being displayed. And then we're also in a sec going to actually make sure to mess with our equal sign. So this is actually going to format it to where it's a little bit bigger and everything just comes together, right? So it'll start to make sense towards the end here. And so now we bring in an align items. We're going to make sure that this one is not going to be centered. It's actually going to be flex end. So that's another thing, guys. Make sure to ignore the little syntaxes that GitHub Copilot is actually bringing up, just because it thinks it knows what I want to do. We're going to say content, justify content right here. We're going to actually say space around, just like that. And then we're going to give this a flex direction column, a padding, right? So it's always important to give everything a little bit of some spacing in between. So it's going to give this a padding of 10, right? And then we're going to give this a word wrap. And we're going to say break word. Okay. And word break. So again, this is going to be for the output of everything, right? So the display of our calculator. And then now we're going to bring in the output, right? So inside of our output class, we have our previous operand and our current operand class inside of those. So simply what we do now, we say output, and then we also bring in our previous operand. Oops. So we say previous operand, and then we're just going to stylize this a little bit and give this a color, right? And we're just going to say 34282C, just like that. And then we're going to give this a font size of that. So once we get our JavaScript up and running, this should display the numbers. You'll be able to see those. Okay, so for now, it's not really outputting anything, of course, because our JavaScript is not functional. So we're going to do something similar, actually. So instead of doing the color, we're just going to say black, actually. So this is going to have a black color. We're going to give this a font size of 2.5. So in this case, I actually knew. And we're going to give this a font weight of bold, okay? And as far as our entire CSS, that's actually pretty much it, right? So we didn't really mess with too much here. I'm a little concerned though for the background. I'm noticing that it's not actually outputting here. Normally we would get the background color to output that, but I think maybe once we bring in our JavaScript, it actually should start working. So once we do that, we'll go ahead and make sure to start to check out to make sure that everything is up and running. So inside of our JavaScript, we want to bring in a class calculator, just like that, right? And inside of that, we're going to have our constructor. So we're going to bring in our previous operand, right? So remember, inside of our HTMLs, we had our JavaScript worded on each one, right? So our delete, our numbers, our pi, our previous operand, right? So we're going to bring those now inside of our JavaScript, right? So to make this a functional working calculator. We're going to say text element, and then we're going to bring in the current element, right? So now that we have that, right, previous operand text element and our current text element, right? So if you remember, that's going to be the ones inside of the output, right? So now it should start displaying once we do this. And we're going to say this previous operand, just like that. And text element, yes, sir. And then it's going to be equal to the, or assigned to, to the previous operand text element. And then we're also going to say this dot current operand text element is going to be assigned to the current text element. So what essentially that's doing is that when we when we press the previous and the current buttons, it's essentially going to override the output on the display. So it's saying like, hey, this previous operand is going to be assigned to the current operand, right? So in other words, it'll override that one. And then afterwards, if we say the current, it'll override the current operand, right? So it's assigning that so it displays the button that you're wanting to display, right? So if you want the previous one to show up, it'll override the current operand, and then it should display that on your calculator for both. And then we're going to say clear. So that's going to, we're bringing in a JavaScript function here, basically saying that it should remove all numbers from that. And then this current, just like that. No. So that one should just be this current. Okay. And then we messed up here for some reason. Okay, so oh yeah, so I'm getting syntax error because I don't have both of my opening brackets here. So we got to make sure we have all our brackets at all time, otherwise it's just going to give me an error. And so now what we have to do is define the clear and the current, right? So the clear is basically saying what that's going to, it's a function we're going to assign it to, and we're saying, hey, this current operand should be equal to empty string. Instead of an empty string, we're going to give that an empty or 0 integer, right? So, or you can do is empty string, I believe, as well. I think it shouldn't be a problem, but I have to say 0. And then anything else, we're going to give the current and the previous. If anything other than 0, it's just going to be undefined. So it'll just give us like an error basically. And then current, this current operand, and we're going to assign this to actually 0 as well. So just like that. So current should be to 0. That's probably not correct. JavaScript, if I'm honest, you probably want to assign that to the previous operand as well. Or I'm sorry, the current to the current operand plus the previous operand But for the sake of time, I'm just going to assign it to 0. I think that should be just fine, if I'm honest. We're going to say this, and to delete, right? So that's going to be our delete button. So now we're bringing up our button for the delete. Where the heck is that? Up here, data delete. So this current, okay. So now we're saying this current operand for delete. And then we're going to define this, and we're going to say current operand dot, and we're going to bring a toString, right? So we're going to make this a string and say we're slicing, so we're removing the current number, and we're simply subtracting 1 of that, right? So just like that. So when we delete something, it'll take the current number and go back 1 essentially. So I'm sorry, it's like popping it off, right? So we're removing it from the calculator. And then we're going to say pi. So the pi, I'm sure there's probably a better way to do this. For the pi, what I'm going to do to assign it, I'm just simply going to give it actually I believe we can say math pi. If not, we can do just say 3.14159. I just went ahead and went on Google and I think added like the most, like I think up to 10 or something like that. So I just said 3.14159265359. Yeah, so that should be okay if I'm honest. Again, this calculator is only going to output up to a certain amount of numbers anyways. And this is not going to be a scientific calculator by any means, you know, of the imagination here. So it doesn't have to necessarily give us an accurate depiction of the infinite number of what pi outputs anyways, in my opinion. So to me, like just having a limit up to 10, in my opinion, should work fine. Again, nobody said this is going to be like a graphing calculator. So do not use this for any professional purposes, right? This is just simply to you know, kind of like work on your JavaScript and your HTML, right? To improve on that, I should say. And so now append number means to add number, right? So every single time we want to add a new number, so we say if number is equal to, right? Point. We say and dot this current. Make sure I'm spelling current correctly. We say operand. Make sure that all of your spelling is correct. Otherwise, some of this stuff might not work. And we're saying this includes decimal. Then we want to return this, oh my gosh, current operand. And just say this current operand dot toString, just like that. And we want to add that or append that to the current number, basically. Long story short, if there's a number there, we want to add that to the current string, right? So it's going to append it. So it continues adding all of our numbers, right? So once we get to the bottom, we should just be able to start displaying all of our functions here. But we have to assign these to, of course, the buttons. Right now we're just creating the functions for all of the buttons, right? Okay, so now we should just be able to add a number to your existing number or to your decimal number, right? So that way it appends to it. It knows what it's doing here. All right, so now we said append to the number. Now last one is going to be here is choose operation, right? And inside of that, make sure to close our brackets. Inside of our brackets, we're saying if open parentheses this current operand, right? So at this point, you should get familiar with the term current operand is assigned to a string. And then we say return and then say, why? Okay, sometimes my buttons aren't working here. So say if this dot previous operand is not equal to, right? So in JavaScript, the exclamation point refers to is not. So usually the opposite of equal to. So it's not equal to string, right? So it's saying like, if this current operand is equal to string, return it. If not, then we want this to say this dot compute, right? So we're going to, in a sec, define compute function. And then now we're going to say this dot operation is assigned to operation, right? And then this dot previous operand is equal to or assigned to this dot current operand. So another thing to note when it comes to JavaScript, equal sign does not mean equal to, it means assigned to, right? So you're kind of overriding the current function or pretty much the current function, right? So that's what it always means when you see an equal to. When it's 2 or more, that means that if it's equal to, right? So at that point, you're saying if is equal to string or integer, then return, right? So at that point, you're doing like an if statement or a loop or of sorts. But in this case, we're pretty much overriding the previous operand with the current operand. In other words, depending on what's being displayed, it's going to override the current display, essentially. And basically, the current display is the one that's at all times being displayed, not the previous one. Okay. And so once we do that, we then say this dot current operand, and we're going to send to an empty string, just like that. Nice. So right here, we included this compute function. And so we have to define that now, right? So let's go ahead and say this compute, and then we're going to say let computation const preview, right? So we're going to make sure that we can start to actually display this onto our calculator. We're going to pass in a float and say this previous operand, just like that. Then we're going to say another one, const. We're going to say current. We're going to parse in another float. Sure I'm spelling everything correctly. This okay, yeah. So sometimes I mess up my letters here, but we're going to say this dot, and then we're again current operand, just like that. Again, I'm having issues here with my spelling. So we already defined the const current, right? So right here, current operand assigned to current up here, right? So current operand is equal to 0. And we're saying current, we want to parse in this float and say this current operand. And then in a sec, we're going to bring in our preview function as well. So we'll go ahead and do that in a sec. And then once we do that, we say if is not, and then preview, right? We're going to have our, there we go. So that those are not slashes. These are actually, what do you call it? It's kind of equivalent to like an if statement. So it's basically saying if not is preview, then not is current, then return. And we're going to include a switch statement actually. So we're going to say switch, then say operation, just like that. And then now we're going to say case plus, and we're going to say computation preview current break. And then we're going to say case string, and then we're going to say subtraction computation. We're going to subtract the current, right? So now essentially what we're doing is that for every single button that we're doing, we're going to give that a function now. So now we're saying, hey, for the computation, the current number we're going to add, or I'm sorry, the previous number we're going to add to the current number. The previous number we're going to subtract the current number, right? And so now, and we're assigning that for each individual button, right? So, and then we're going to say break after each one, right? So that way it knows like, okay, we're done with that specific computation. And now we're going to do for the multiplication. So remember, whatever it is that you assigned your buttons to on the HTML, it's always important to make sure that they line up with this one. And again, we're going to multiply that, going to include a break, and then same thing right here. And this is going to be lastly for your division, computation, and just like that, we're going to divide the current one and then say break. And then if not, we're just going to say default return. So default return, yes, sir. And then now we're almost done with this right here. We're going to say this current operand is assigned to the computation. This operation is undefined. And this previous is going to be assigned to an empty string, just like that. Right? Okay. All right, so now this is where we get to display our numbers, luckily, right? So we can see now that our entire function should start actually, I'm sorry, our entire calculus should start working, right? So we're going to bring in string number. We're going to assign that to a number string. We're basically saying, hey, string, and then right here we're saying const integer. Am I spelling integer right? I swear, sometimes I don't know. I don't even know. We're going to parse in a float, and we're going to split that actually by 1, not by 2. Right? So we want to make sure that we split the integers by 1. So what we're saying is that now, instead of integer, split is going to divide after your decimal point. We're going to split that number after the fact, right? And then afterwards, we can start adding more strings afterwards. So that basically makes our decimal point functional right here. And afterwards, we say let integer display. And then we say if nan, and we say integer digits, and then we're going to say integer display to string number, right? So in this case, we're just going to say the string just like that, not necessarily the string number. And then since this is an if statement, we're going to say else integer display integer digits dot, oh no, okay, integer digits to, I'm gonna say to local string. Make sure this is in English. And then we're gonna say maximum fraction digits, just like that, 0. Cool. And then now, let's see, let's make sure we have everything here. Just like that. So make sure if, we're closing out of that if statement right here. Okay. And now we're saying if decimal digits is null, we're going to return integer display dot decimal digits, and then we're going to say else we're going to return integer display. There we go. So we got to make sure, let me just double make sure I have both of them matching, right? So basically saying string number is going to be assigned to number to string. This is again our display, right? So make sure that we display our numbers here. And we're bringing in our number, and then we're going to parse in a float and basically saying like, hey, integer. And it's any single time we bring in a decimal point, we're going to make sure to split the numbers. Then afterwards, we're making sure that decimal, if not displayed, then it'll return null, right? So it doesn't display on there, it's not functioning, right? Or it's functioning, but it's not being displayed. There we go. So now we can just bring in our update display. So like that, we're going to bring in, not going to have anything inside of our function. And now we're just going to say this current operand text element dot inner text, and then now we basically sometimes I don't like GitHub Copilot. I probably should have turned it off if I'm honest. Get display number, this dot current operand, and then we're saying if this dot operation is null, I'm sorry, is not, it'll be null, right? And then we're saying if null, this previous operand text element and then we're going to say, we're going to bring it in little asterisks like that, just like that. And then we're saying, so this is for our HTML, saying this, get display number, going to open up your parentheses here, say this previous operand, then we're going to close out of that, just like that. And then we're going to bring in another number sign, saying this operation, just like that. And then, yes, and then we're saying else statement right here. Okay, wait. Operation, else, there we go. So we're going to say else, and then say this dot previous operand text element dot inner text, and then we're going to send to an empty string, just like that. Okay, cool. All right, so that pretty much was all that goes into the class inside of our calculator, right? So it looks like everything is functional, right? So pretty much now we just have to assign our entire function to the actual buttons themselves, basically, right? So that's why we have all of these data operation, data numbers, so forth and so on. Now that we defined all of our functions in here. So now basically we say const, right? So make sure, okay, another thing. So at the very beginning, we open up this bracket, and that's why we call this class calculator, right? And so now we can close out of that class. And so below our class, we're now going to bring in our numbers, right? So we're going to say number buttons. It's going to be document. We're going to say query selector. We're saying data number, right? Okay, so I went ahead and just pasted the rest of them in just because it is a repetitive motion. And so I think for this, just to explain really quickly, all we're doing is saying we're bringing calling this function number buttons, right? So if you remember inside of our HTML, we call each function in there, and we're assigning that function to the document inside of our HTML to those specific functions that we named inside of the HTML, right? So data number is equal to all of our buttons, right? Data number equals button is assigned to the equals button, which is, I believe, down here, right? Data equals, right? So if you say equals button, document query selector equals, right? And notice specifically with the number buttons, we make sure to say query selector all, right? So all numbers, and as well as with their operation, right? So operation buttons, which is going to be to the data operation. So all of our operators basically, right? So our division, multiplication, so forth and so on. But for the other ones, right? So like for our pi button, we're just simply assigning that to data.pi, right? So because it's a single, just a single button, right? So we don't want every button under the roof of, and so just to avoid any errors, right? So we just want to say query selector to that specific button, right? So we want to specifically call for the data delete, all clear button, previous, current, operand, so forth and so on. So now that we call that, okay, just getting emails here. So now that we call that, we can just say const calculator, and we're going to say new calculator. And then now we say previous, operand, and text element, current operand, and text element, right? So like that, const calculator is assigned to news. Okay, that's what I was wondering. I was like, what's going on here? New calculator, current, and previous, right? And now we bring in our number buttons. And we're saying for each button, we're going to say button, and we're going to add an event listener. We're saying click, right? So basically it works with our mouse. And then we open that up again with another bracket. We're saying calculator, and we're going to append the number, right? So we're going to add the number to the, we're saying button inner text, just like that. And then we're saying update display, right? So basically, long story short, we're saying we're basically making the buttons functional, right? We're bringing an event listener saying like, hey, if I click on the button, it's going to append that number to the display, right? So it's going to add that number to the display. So we can get out of that. Now we're going to do that for the other ones as well. Buttons, and the same for each button, just like that. We're going to open up a bracket. Right, so at this point, the rest of it should be very repetitive, similar to what we did right here, right? So similar concept, we're just going to do that for the rest of the buttons. And after we do that, it should work pretty much, right? So every button should display on the calculator, unless I messed up somewhere. So we'll go ahead and see afterwards. So now we're saying for each button, okay, so before update display, yes. So now we're saying operation buttons, right? So for our operator buttons, okay, so now we're going to say add event listener. I lost my button. I lost my train of thought there. So add event listener. We're saying again click, just like that, right? Because we want to make sure that every button is, of course, functional. Again, open up the brackets, just like we did last time. We're saying calculator, choose operation button, inner text, and then update the display, just like that, right? So choose operation, then button, enter display, and then update to the display with that button, right? And so for the rest of them, I think I'm just going to pretty much just copy and paste that over, just because they're all literally the same thing, right? And I'll make sure to give you guys a few moments to be able to overlook them. But pretty much the same concept, right? So all we're doing for each individual button that we assign to each function, we're saying, hey, look, click said button, and it's going to bring in the compute function, right? So if you guys remember at the very top, right? So we define that right here, where pretty much every function is going to take the previous operand and the current operand, right? Which we assigned up here, and it's going to either add it, subtract it, multiply it, or divide it, right? So that's what we're doing there. So it's computing that, and we're saying update the display with that, okay? And then with the all clear button, we're just bringing a clear function, which is going to basically make it into a empty string. In this case, I added a 0, right? And then the delete button, it's bringing in the delete function. I believe for that one, I just did a dot clear, right? So dot clear, delete. Oh, so it's a slice function actually. So what we're doing is subtracting each individual number from it. So we're saying 0, and then we're subtracting that by -1, right? So that's what we're doing for the delete button there, and then it's updating the display. And then with the current button, we're just assigning that current and then updating that display. And with the pi, again, we're bringing our pi function, which is 3.14 whatever, you know, and then updating that on the display as well. So okay guys, after like 15 minutes of troubleshooting, there was a few minor errors in there where my wording wasn't actually correct. And so even starting with the styles.css, notice how earlier the background function actually wasn't functioning. I guess you could say that. So I went ahead and had to actually completely rewrite some of the code just to make sure that what was going on there. But it is now corrected, right? So one thing I ended up doing before was we had the HTML on the very top. So instead, I just ended up removing that and added that inside of our asterisk function. I'm sorry, instead of our asterisk CSS, cascading that. Afterwards, I went to double check. I'm not 100% sure exactly what it was. So I had to just pretty much rewrite some of the code to see what's going on here. It very well could have just easily been that I miswrote some of the colors, right? So it could be something that minor, as well as the buttons, right? So the buttons, they should have individually had rounded buttons, right? So something I must have messed up there as well, right? So, but now it all seems to be working just fine. And again, I'll leave the code down in the description below, right? So if you guys want to go check that out, please be sure. So in case you follow the tutorial all the way through and there was some kind of mishap there, you can go in there and check that for yourself as well. So to make sure that it's working just fine. As well as the JavaScript, before we wasn't displaying, but now it actually is, right? So we're actually getting it to work just fine, as you can see right here, right? And so we say multiply that by 2, boom, it displays our number. And of course we can clear that. And we have our delete button, right? So we can delete that, because remember what we did in our JavaScript to delete, we just simply sliced it and then subtracted it by 1, right? So just like that. So we're subtracting every single one. And then to clear, right? Our clear, we're just simply removing that with a 0, right? So what you couldn't even do is just remove this and say, if previous string is 0, and then we just hit that, it pretty much just makes it empty as well, right? So that's why I said, like, you can always just go in there, either add a 0 or just leave that as an empty string. Probably for the sake of proper JavaScript, you probably want to leave that as an empty string, just because you might get errors along the way. But again, this is not going to be a graphing calculator, right? So you don't want to use this for any real professional work. It's just going to be for the sake of practicing JavaScript. But everything seems to be working just fine now. It looks like everything is displaying on the calculator itself, and we have our background gradients working. We did end up adding our radius buttons, right? So make sure that everything's rounded off and everything hovers just fine, so you can see that everything works perfectly, right? So if you guys enjoy this tutorial, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and again, I'll leave the code down in the description below for you guys to follow as well. So with that being said, guys, I'll see you on the next one.